The reason I like to do this is because in the actual preamble of the statute, I believe that it really gives you what I consider to be the default rule of the Brown Act. When all else fails, if you are thinking about how to proceed, you want to think about this purpose and this rule. So under the Brown Act, it expressly states that the people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. In essence, the entire purpose and intent of the statute is so that your actions, which are actions of a legislative body, can be taken openly, and that your deliberations can be conducted openly so that the members of the public have an opportunity to participate and to engage in that process. It's all about empowerment from my perspective. So the Brown Act, as I said, applies to local legislative bodies. Local legislative bodies are bodies created either by statute, by your Board of Supervisors. The most common legislative bodies would be our Board of Supervisors, our city council members, school boards, but also the statute says that legislative bodies include bodies created by those legislative bodies, which would be this one, for instance. But essentially, from our Board of Supervisors, it would be work groups, it could be committees, it could be blue ribbon commissions. The actual name doesn't matter or govern, it's the function of the group that matters or determines whether or not you are governed by the Brown Act. So just some examples there. You know, and I forgot to mention, my presentation, I like to keep it a little light, so if for whatever reason you have a question or a follow-up, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to take your questions in between my presentation. Okay, so when does the Brown Act apply? The Brown Act applies when there is a gathering of a majority of your membership, otherwise known as a quorum. And if there is a quorum, if there are at least 51% of your membership present in one room, and you guys are hearing or discussing or deliberating any item of business that is within your subject matter jurisdiction, if that is happening, then the Brown Act applies, which means we will be required to comply with other requirements of the Brown Act. So you don't necessarily have to make a decision or take an action. The mere fact that you're getting together and discussing an item that's presumably within your subject matter jurisdiction would implicate the Brown Act. And then of course there are exceptions, right? The Brown Act doesn't always apply all the time when you get together with the members. The exceptions of the Brown Act is the Brown Act does not apply to meetings of employees of your agency. So that means that your staff, the staff that helps you put your agendas together, figures out where you're going to meet, if there's a location change, they can talk to you and they can talk to each other about items of business, and they would be exempt from the Brown Act. Which sort of makes sense because they're not necessarily the ones who have the authority to take an action. And of course, the Brown Act also would not apply to communications, particularly emails, as long as it's between one member or another. The key here is to make sure that if you're going to dialogue with another member of the commission, that you are aware of your conversations and how many members you're communicating with. As long as it's less than a quorum, then you should be fine. It can get really tricky though, especially with technology and with emails. So I like to include this bullet point here just to remind us all that even if you're going to be communicating with less than a quorum of the members about an item of business, especially by email, or even if you're responding to your staff, I would encourage all of you not to hit that reply all. Just reply to the individual sender. And the reason I say that is because it's really easy for us to hit reply all, especially when there's more of a quorum of members that receive the email, and you talk about something and suddenly you have a potential Brown Act violation. So it's always safer to reply to the one person or to blind copy your recipients. So the Brown Act also doesn't apply to conferences and similar gatherings which are open to the public. That would be, for instance, meetings of the Board of Supervisors. A quorum of your membership can agree to attend a meeting of the Board of Supervisors. You can even provide public testimony if you wish. You're allowed to do so just like any member of the public, as long as you refrain from discussing items within your subject matter jurisdiction. And then, of course, you're welcome to attend any meeting that's open to the public. Community meetings are really popular. Again, the key here is to not talk with one another about the work that you do in your commission, but you can certainly get together to respond to any of the items of business or meetings within the community or other legislative bodies. And then, of course, you guys are allowed to go to lunch, right? Purely ceremonial social events. So you can also get together, and it could be it could be a majority or more of your membership at purely social events. However, keep in mind that if you're going to be meeting together at that kind of event, besides sort of monitoring your own conversations, refraining from talking about items of business that are within your sort of purview, you also want to keep in mind, or at least I like to advise my commissions to keep in mind, the perception. So, for instance, if you like to get together before a meeting to have breakfast or to have lunch, and you're not talking about items of business, you're just getting together to talk about anything else. But what happens oftentimes is the public might have the perception that you may be violating the Brown Act. And so I would encourage you to sort of consider those types of perceptions that might be occurring, especially if it's happening out in the public. And if you can avoid that, that would be advised. We like to emphasize that part. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about subsidiary bodies. So sometimes, well, I take that back. Oftentimes, our work groups, our commissions, will create subcommittees to help you do the work that you're directed to do by the board or by statute or otherwise, which is completely appropriate. Depending on how you create that work group, depending on the function of the work group, that will determine whether or not the Brown Act applies to that subgroup. So I'm going to right now go through sort of a list of elements that would subject a subcommittee to an ad hoc body, which would not be covered by the Brown Act, as opposed to a subcommittee that somehow transforms itself into a standing committee, which would be subject to the Brown Act. So for ad hoc committees, it's usually comprised of your members of your membership, and it's less than a quorum. So as long as it's less than a quorum of members. And generally, it's only advisory, so you're directed to do something, come back to the body and advise the body on how to proceed or move forward. And generally, it is short-term, meaning you have a directive. Your body asks less than a quorum of the members to get together to draft a report on the issues presented on the next month's agenda, and you'd like that report back in X amount of days, something like that. And of course, there's no fixed schedule. When you're creating this subcommittee, you don't say within the creation of the committee, and you will meet every Tuesday at 2 p.m. in this office. As long as you take these elements, the Brown Act would not apply. Your members would be able to meet, wouldn't have to open that meeting up to the public, and can interact with whatever and whomever they wish to interact with or consult with to come back to the group with that advice. But yes, I have a question.
Sorry about that. Is that better?
Much.
In terms of the no fixed meeting schedule, if an ad hoc committee is set up to meet perhaps for 10 meetings, can that be once a week without being a problem?
You can meet whenever, for ad hoc committees, for the Brown Act not to apply, when your body is creating that subcommittee, as long as you're not creating it with your directive that you're going to meet 10 times once a week at this certain period of time. You want to avoid that. Instead, you want to keep the creation general and say 3 members of the body will get together and you're directed to do this and come back to the body with this recommendation by this date. That's enough to create the body. Let the individuals determine for themselves when they will be meeting, It could be bi-weekly, it could change, the location can change, you can go from one person's home to another, as long as it's not part of the directive. That's really what is governing that creation, or what triggers that creation. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so standing committees. These are sort of elements of a standing committee, and one is, it could probably be less than a quorum of members. Usually when committees or commissions create subcommittees, they generally make them with less than a quorum in mind. However, the characteristics here would be, sometimes the commission wants to include members outside of our body, stakeholders, CBOs, someone who would be valuable to provide input to the subcommittee. If they are officially made members of this subcommittee group, that's a potential element that would implicate the Brown Act. It could be purely advisory, but sometimes they can have decision-making authority that's conferred to it on the commission. That also implicates the Brown Act whenever that gets triggered. And then, of course, when you create a subcommittee, that generally has standing subject matter jurisdiction. So what I mean by that is you say, we're creating a subcommittee on the bylaws, and that the members of that subcommittee are required to continuously review the bylaws and recommend revisions and updates to the commission as necessary. There is no end date, generally is long-standing. That also technically implicates the Brown Act. And then, of course, when you're creating this subcommittee, you're creating it with the fixed schedule in mind. And the bylaws subcommittee will meet every 2 months on this date at this time. If those factors or elements are in play, the Brown Act would apply. And you will be required to follow what I'm about to get into right now, which is a little detailed, but I'll try to go through it really quickly. So before I get into the details, I want to talk a little bit more about serial meetings and about the emails implications that I was talking about earlier. So the goal here is not to inadvertently discuss an item of business or that's within your wheelhouse with more than a quorum of your membership outside of an open meeting setting. So how do we make sure we don't accidentally violate that, or inadvertently violate that? Serial meetings are prohibited under the Brown Act. A serial meeting is basically a conversation you might have with one person, and then that person takes that context and the substance of that conversation, shares it with a third member, says, Lily said this, and here's how we think we should vote on agenda item X, and then so forth, until eventually you have a majority of your members with knowledge about how you're going to move or what your thoughts are on a particular item of business. That's prohibited under the Brown Act. And the easiest way to violate that unintentionally is by hitting that reply all button where you say something about something on your agenda or about an item of business, but now all of a sudden you've shared it with the entire group. So you want to avoid it for that reason. But something that happens often too is, in addition to the whole telephone game, there's also the wheel and spoke example. So I'll get into that in a moment. So we have a group, and there are 6 members on the commission, for instance. Joe speaks to, we have Joe, John, Mary, Susie, Michael, and Laura. John speaks to Michael and says, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is how I think you should vote too. What do you think? What do you say? And they have a discussion. Michael says, great. Michael then takes that conversation, shares it with Laura, and says, hey, Laura, John and I were talking about such and such. Here's what we were thinking. Here's what we think we should do, and so forth. Now you have a Brown Act violation. So we want to avoid that type of conversation, whether it happens in the elevator, whether it happens by email, whether it happens when you're having lunch. The location doesn't matter. It's really the idea of the majority of your membership. Any questions on that before I move forward? Yes.
We are a self-electing body, so we elect our leadership. And I am wondering if that can be a Brown Act violation, or can we campaign among ourselves?
Thank you for your question. So I understand that there are sometimes positions and circumstances where you would vote for someone of your body to take a position, I'm guessing. It could be chair, vice chair, or sometimes it could be other positions. Certainly you are allowed to communicate with your members about the fact that you would like to run or would like to be nominated. However, campaigning, you have to be very careful with that. I would encourage you to do that in open session because it is an item of business. It is within your wheelhouse. We don't want to sort of campaign behind closed doors where the members of the public aren't aware that you're even contemplating running or the reasons behind why you would like to be considered or elected or nominated. You can, again, discuss that conversation with less than a quorum of your members or one-on-one with someone, but be very vigilant and careful not to inadvertently violate the Brown Act. It's best practice to agendize that item and have an open discussion with all of your members at an open meeting, and then the dialogue can ensue from there.